Hi, everyone. We're just giving folks a minute to jump on and then we'll get started. Great to see everyone. We have more folks jumping on, but we'll jump into the webinar. My name is Kat Lyons, and I work as the Network Associate for the Network for Landscape Conservation. The Network for Landscape Conservation is pleased to continue our Landscape Conservation in Action webinar series into 2023. I just want to provide a brief overview of the network, introduce our speakers very briefly, and then just provide a few logistics, and then we'll get started. So, brief overview of the network. We launched in 2011, and the Network for Landscape Conservation is a national umbrella group and leading voice for advancing collaborative landscape conservation, striving really to connect people to ideas and innovations and to each other. So the network is a community as much as an organization, a community connected by shared work of collaborative landscape conservation. We have two speakers today for the Insights in the New Global Biodiversity Framework, Impacts and What Happens Next webinar, and that'll be Deb Davidson and Laur, and you're welcome to put your videos on. Just a couple logistics before they get speaking and have a great conversation. As we listen to the presenters today, please submit your questions in the Q&A, and if you prefer to submit them, you can also use the chat, but I'll be very much looking forward to seeing the Q&A and be keeping track of that very closely. And then once the presenters are done, we'll be using the remaining 15 to 30 minutes to answer your questions that come up as we go along. So with that, I'll hand it off to Deb, and thank you so much.
Hi, thanks for joining us today. My name is Deb Davidson. I am Vice President at the Center for Large Landscape Conservation based in Bozeman, Montana. I also wear the hat of being the Associate Director for the Network for Landscape Conservation. And I was fortunate to spend 2 weeks in Montreal at the COP15. I know a number of you who are on the line were also there. And it couldn't have come at a more important time for the planet in terms of setting the framework and the plans for the next 7 years to move forward as a global community on conservation and stewardship. It was truly a pure pleasure and honor to be there and to watch what happened with the negotiations, but also all the side events. And Erin and I are really excited today just to show you a little bit, give you a snapshot into what took place there and to give you a feel for how the tones of conversations and the negotiations were, but also to talk about what happens next and why this is so important for landscape conservation here in the US and globally. So Erin, I'll hand it over to you now.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Laur. I manage the International Connectivity Program at the Center for Large Landscape Conservation. I also live in Bozeman, Montana. A lot of my work involves engaging in policy processes at international level, especially within multilateral environmental agreements. I'll tell you a little bit more about that as we go. I also operate a number of volunteer professional networks, chiefly the IUCN WCPA, World Commission on Protected Areas, Connectivity Conservation Specialist Group, and its working groups. And I also operate a number of projects around the world. So I'll hand it back to Deb for a little more introduction into our organization.
So the Center for Large Landscape Conservation was started in 2009 by Gary Tabor, who many of you know. And we are an organization focused solely on the practice of taking a landscape approach to work and focus specifically on connectivity conservation. Our mission is to conserve life on Earth by reconnecting the natural world. And our focus is very much on creating networks of experts and partners across the globe to advance a focus of science, policy, and practice to ensure connectivity conservation. I'm going to have Erin shift next slide. And one of the organizations in particular I want to highlight who's hosting us today is the Network for Landscape Conservation. And that is, we're fiscally sponsored, or we're the fiscal home for the network. Network is focused on the practice of landscape conservation. And I know that's why many of you are here, because you're involved in that. We have the Catalyst Fund also, which is an effort of ours that focuses on supporting collaborative conservation efforts across the country by specifically funding coordinators and providing skill set development of coordination of landscape efforts. This slide demonstrates the variety of networks that we do host. NLC is a key one. The U.S. Biosphere Reserve network is also a new network that we are now hosting. Bringing this up because I think this is critically important to understand the exchange of information, and as we move forward in the implementation of the Global Biodiversity Framework, also the US work like the America the Beautiful, these networks are critically important in both sharing best practices, learning from one another, ensuring that we have peer exchange. 7 years to reach 2030 isn't very much time. And we don't want to see people creating their own solutions without sharing. So we want to see best practices being shared as much as possible. That's why we feel these networks are so critical. In the middle, you'll see there's also, we move into more of the networks on an international level, and that's what Erin is really going to talk about, and how we ended up being at the COP, the role that the IUCN and the Connectivity Conservation Specialist Group has played within moving forward a lot of the Global Biodiversity Framework targets. So Erin, I will shift to you.
Thanks, Doug. So as a non-governmental organization based in the United States, we have the opportunity to also contribute to a lot of international processes. And over the years, especially since 2016, we have been an NGO national member of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. It's up there in the left-hand corner. We're also an observer organization to the UN Environment Program based in Nairobi, Kenya. We're also an observer to the Convention on Migratory Species, which has its secretariat based in Bonn, Germany. And we are also an observer to the Convention on Biological Diversity, and that's how we followed the long process of getting to Montreal, and also engaging in a number of ways while we were there, and also before we ever got there. We partner with the UN Commission on Combating Desertification, and we've also been engaged in the new Decade for Ecosystem Restoration, and continue to have discussions with the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands, and also starting to engage in the IPBES, that's called the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. It is really the chief scientific biodiversity body that advises in all of these different international processes. So the road to Montreal was very long, and if some of you followed really from 2018 through December 2022, there was a constant process of negotiation that was happening through certain working groups, different meetings around the world, and continually trying to hone, especially the Global Biodiversity Framework, which everyone was calling at that time this post-2020 framework, and a number of the other decisions that were going towards COP15 in Montreal. But some of the things that happened in the period between 18 and 2022 was that we worked with the Convention on Migratory Species to actually include a definition of ecological connectivity in one of its official decisions that they adopted at their COP13 that was in India in 2020. Also, because we lead the Connectivity Conservation Specialist Group out of our office, we were able to work with partners around the world to create the first ever IUCN guidelines for connectivity. And it's a publication that came out in the Protected Areas series within IUCN. And we've already accomplished now 5 translations of that book, and we're now soon to produce the 6th translation in Chinese. There's also policy processes within IUCN, and we led the drafting of 2 policy resolutions, one for addressing ecological connectivity, especially in the post-2020 process, and also for promoting wildlife-friendly infrastructure. So these were official decisions made by the Assembly of IUCN, and that was some of this preparatory policy work, laying the groundwork, moving towards Montreal. Also in the meantime, last year, there was the 2nd Asia Parks Congress and also the 1st Africa Protected Areas Congress. And they also adopted action plans, and inside of those action plans were a number of areas where they were addressing landscape conservation, connectivity conservation, and also avoiding and mitigating the impacts of linear infrastructure. So a lot of questions still come out. Why is COP15 so important? Well, it really, as the Convention of Biological Diversity, has almost near universal participation. And it took 4 years, but those 4 years were very valuable to craft the language and really, I think, gain traction and a lot of momentum towards institutions and people understanding the process and knowing what they wanted to do with the decisions that would come out of the COP. So there are 188 governments that were represented there. And while the Global Biodiversity Framework was one of the decisions, decision 15.4, there's a number of decisions that came out, and I was looking the other day, at least 29 official decisions have come out that are to shape the policy and the ways moving forward for the entire convention and its protocols. One thing I did want to mention is that there was also a monitoring framework that was adopted, and I'll tell you some more about that. And resource mobilization, it's important to understand that it was a major sticking point during negotiations was, well, how is this all going to be funded? And it was agreed that there will be a special trust fund established, and they're going to move through phases 23, 24, and then 25 through 30 to really ramp up and bring the funding that many of the governments know they need to bring towards implementation of the overall framework. So again, this is so important because this is setting up the strategic plan for the convention for the next 10 years. And at the heart of it is halting and reversing biodiversity loss. But it again it's setting up what we hope is 2050 and actually achieving the overall vision that was adopted already in 2020, which is that biodiversity is valued, conserved, restored, and wisely used. So what's in the Global Biodiversity Framework? Well, one thing I have to mention is it took a lot of time and a lot of sleepless nights for many of the governments to be able to agree on the text that came out of the COP. So these 2 photos that are there on the left are actually the contact groups where specific goals and targets would be negotiated line for line, track changes, sometimes hours into the night, 1, 2, 3 in the morning, to be able to settle on something that could go to the plenary and eventually be adopted. So you may have heard there's 4 main goals. I'm really going to focus on goal A. That's especially where a lot of the landscape and connectivity related decisions were made, but there are 23 targets, and I'll point some of those out to you as well. So for landscapes and connectivity, goal A is really focused on overall functionality of ecosystems, and connectivity as well as integrity are fundamental within that goal. Then underneath goal A, target 1 is focused especially on biodiversity inclusive spatial planning. Target 2 is restoration of entire landscapes and seascapes. Target 3 is really the 30 by 30 goal, and that there should be well-connected, protected, and conserved areas that are managed within the wider landscapes and seascapes. And some of this language has actually evolved since the original Aichi Target 11, if any of you had heard about that before. That was really the only place within the CBD strategic plan where connectivity and landscapes were being dealt with. And now there's actually been an expansion, and I really feel like a focusing of applying connectivity and landscape approaches to achieving many of the goals and targets across the framework. I'd also like to mention Target 14, which really is the full push that all sectors, all governments should be taking to have policies and regulations, planning processes that are meeting the goals of the framework. And here's just a couple of the other related targets, and I think especially for many of you dealing with many different issues within your landscapes, we're really talking about species conservation, human wildlife conflict, addressing climate change, managing wild species, sustainable use of wild species, dealing with sectoral issues in agriculture, fisheries, forestry. There's an emphasis on nature's contributions to people, but also really bringing more focus, to the role of business and corporations and that mainstream and integration that has to happen across all sectors. And then Target 19 lands on it again, that we have to increase the level of financial resources from all sources to be able to do this right and do it together. And I had mentioned the monitoring framework. So this is the list of what are called headline and complementary indicators that have been agreed to start to measure progress on what was agreed to in the framework. So many of these things are readily available to governments. Many of these things are being used by academia and science right now, and can be readily used really by anyone to help to measure their success on the ground. And I'm going to pass back to Deb, and she's going to tell us about some of the exciting things that are happening in the hallways and in other parts of the convention center while those negotiations were taking place.
Yeah, so we were there. So Aaron was there for 3 weeks and I was there for a little over 2. I didn't get to see Aaron a lot because he was often in the negotiating room. And the role that I played and other staff from CLC was to actually be involved in the side events, which were almost as important as the negotiations in many ways, because those were where we actually got to interact with our partners from around the globe, Biden administration officials, USAID, World Bank was all present. We actually, CLC co-sponsored 2 side events, both with World Wildlife Fund. And one of them was called the Nature Positive Infrastructure side event, where we highlighted the reason that linear infrastructure is has such impact on connectivity across the globe, and really highlighted some key solutions and opportunities that the Global Biodiversity Framework could incorporate. And these side events, if you think about them, were really an opportunity to both reach the ministers from various countries, negotiators, and to emphasize that there are solutions out there. So these were going on the first 2 weeks before decisions had been made about the negotiations. So it was really an opportunity to influence decision making. And that was really how they were set up. So this one in particular around nature positive infrastructure was focused on making the case that linear infrastructure should be addressed across the globe as part of the solution. If it's not addressed, biodiversity is going to continue to be severely impacted. The other side event that we were involved with, and you can see some pictures, Jody Hilty's there, who's also a member of the Network for Landscape Conservation, and others, was focused on how do you integrate ecological connectivity into the GBF. And that was where we were able to highlight those guidelines that Aaron was talking about, a lot of the monitoring, but also give some actual practical solutions on how this has been done around the globe. Again, making the case, trying to catch those negotiators before they make their just final decisions, and also trying to make the case to entities like the World Bank and the Global Environment Facility that why these issues are important for them to invest in moving forward. So Erin, next one. Just give you some, as our slides move forward, give you an idea of what those events looked like. A lot of the big organizations from around the globe, Nature Conservancy, World Wildlife Fund, Conservation International, had put together something they called the Nature Positive Pavilion. So up in the upper left side, you'll see basically their logo that they created. There was this beautiful, lovely place that many of us hung out in, and I'd say most conservation groups kind of met there. A lot of the funders, the Global Environment Facility was right next door, but it was this huge pavilion where it was really an opportunity for us to meet with our partners and networks. At that facility, or at that space, I should say, we collectively with World Wildlife Fund and others who are part of something we call the Nature and Infrastructure Coalition, hosted a full day of meetings focused specifically on linear infrastructure and solutions from around the globe. We were able to highlight a lot of the examples from the US that have been successful, including projects like the Highway 93 work that the Confederated Salish Kootenai have done, and other efforts that are moving forward, including our Wildlife Crossings pilot project here in the United States. So those were used as an opportunity to highlight how countries could address linear infrastructure. So that was a full day event there. I have to say, for the best coffee, we figured this out the last week, and I just have to highlight this because I have to humanize this whole event. You can imagine we're in this big, huge building all day long and there's limited food, but we finally figured out that last week that the Global Environment Facility, who was right next to the Nature Positive Pavilion, had the best free coffee. And so those were the kind of things we started to share with one another, because it was a long week. This is just a little bit of a shot of this picture on the left, just gives you an idea of the scale. There were people everywhere. In this huge hall, this was the main hall, and just gives you a sense. We all had to wear masks every day, and we had to be testing every day for COVID, so it was kind of intense. But one of the things I wanted to highlight here too is just the youth engagement. The Convention on Biological Diversity sponsored a ton of youth to be able to come to the event. They had to apply. Anyone under 35 qualified for this. And there was a youth-specific pavilion. There was a lot of mentoring and opportunity for learning for them. And so this was a picture of one of they tried to capture a lot of the youth that were part of this youth program in this one picture in the middle. And then I also wanted to highlight that there were protests that happened throughout much of the 3 weeks also. This one was actually inside. This was fostering that idea of the nature positive, which became really a catchphrase and a big catchphrase at the event. So this one was more of a press event, but then there were protests for many, I'd say a few a week easily, outside of the event. Some of them saying that this GBF is kind of not going to go far enough, and so pushing for more. There was a beautiful couple hour long protest that went through the streets of Montreal on one of the Saturdays while we were there, really focusing on Indigenous rights. So it was lovely to see that happening. I want to also highlight some of in addition to side events, there were actual events, multiple day events that were organized. One of them was called the Nature and Culture Summit. And that's one of the pictures from the left of an elder from a First Nation in Northern Canada. And this was incredibly well attended, really well organized, and featuring Indigenous leaders from around the globe, talking about the need, again, to ensure that Indigenous rights were included in the GBF, that investments are made in that direction. And again, these were events that took place that second week, so before the final negotiations took place. And again, the argument and the reason these were happening was to really say to the negotiators, please invest in these things. So it was an opportunity for leaders to demonstrate the why and the how. So this featured, a lot of the challenges that Indigenous communities across the globe are facing, but also some of the solutions that have been moved forward. In the far right corner, bottom right corner, is Harvey Locke, who many of you know. He organized a really successful multiple-hour funder panel where they featured what private philanthropy can do to support the Global Biodiversity Framework moving forward and to address the climate crisis, biodiversity crisis we're facing. And then in the middle, the reason I highlighted that was just to remind us that China was actually the host of this event, even though it was in Canada. Almost every country who was there was 196 countries represented, had pavilions that they set up. China's was the biggest, rightfully so, they were the host. All day long, you could go get tea, you could practice calligraphy, they hosted certain talks. It was kind of one of the main center places where people were meeting. All right, next, Erin. So I'm going to shift a little bit to the why and the role that the US played there. And for the 3 weeks, there were Biden administration, State Department officials that were there. There was increased participation that last week when the negotiations were really getting serious. Now, the US is not a signatory, but they had a presence there and are very committed to carrying forward the Global Biodiversity Framework targets. They did host, this picture's from a morning meeting, couple-hour meeting we had with the CQ and State Department officials. They basically asked, us leaders, conservation groups, how can we, what are the priorities for you guys? Where does this fall in terms of US engagement internationally, but also domestically? And you can see some of the quotes from Monica Medina and and Chairwoman Brenda Mallory both spoke at a high level session with other world leaders, emphasizing the commitment of the US to carrying out the GBF. And Erin and I will talk a little bit more about how that's already being done. Before we shift into next steps, I want to just also highlight the announcements that were made at the COP. The first couple days of the event, first part of December, Canada came out really strong. They were the co-host. I mean, they were obviously the official, in-country host. And Trudeau showed up strong with announcements around further investment in Indigenous-led conservation projects, $510 million, and then also the formalizing of what they have had for a number of years and has been led by the Indigenous Leadership Institute, but a formalizing from the federal government of the Indigenous Guardians Network and increased investment in that. So that was really exciting to see those two things. They also, Canada also stepped up with another $350 million right out of the gate to support international biodiversity efforts. So Canada kind of set that tone, and then we saw other countries jumping in. We also saw the launch of the High Ambition Coalition, which is made up of, I think there's 100, can't remember exactly how many now, 130 countries around the globe who have stepped up to say, we commit to carrying out the goals of the Global Biodiversity Framework. The US is one of them. If you go on the High Ambition Coalition website, you can see who is a current signatory. That is really an effort. Many of you know Brian O'Donnell and the Campaign for Nature, that they are deeply involved with moving that forward. There were supposedly over 2,000 corporations there, and there were numerous business and nature events. There was huge focus on biodiversity credits, so that developing a market around the protection of biodiversity, similar to a climate credit. One of the things that was launched there, again, there was lots of announcements, and it makes sense because you have the world stage, you have the you have the world looking here. And so why not announce right now? One of those was this Nature Action 100, which is a major mobilization effort of major financial companies to invest in nature. So those were some positives that I think in terms of where this leads, there's a lot of questions. What does this mean? But there was clear presence from corporations, businesses, financial institutions there, and saying that this is an important thing for us to invest in moving forward. Aaron.
So moving from what was agreed on paper and many commitments made while we were in Montreal, the practicalities for this to move from the international policy arena and really mainstream into country level efforts involves aligning and revising what are called National Biodiversity Strategic Action Plans, or NBSAPs. So those plans are written by the contracting parties to the convention, and they have been written, let's say, in cycles over years when a COP takes place and a new strategy is agreed, and countries need to then bring their language up to speed in what they're going to do at home and on the ground. So that is a process that has started. There's already some finance that's flowing towards jumpstarting a lot of this revision. And it's also something that we as an organization and with other partners have been looking at is, well, what countries can we work with? What do countries need? How could we help them to revise those and align those plans? A lot of the funding that is going to go towards implementation is coming from the Global Environment Facility. You might have heard of GEF before. And GEF is currently in its 7th round of funding, but it has a new round of funding that will be coming up that is called the GEF 8. And GEF 8 also includes 11 integrated programs, everything from wildlife focused to more protected area focused. There's also an integrated program on impacts of infrastructure, making infrastructure more sustainable. And so there already are statements of interest that have gone in from countries towards the GEF to start lining up those projects that are going to be implementing the overall framework. And countries are also asked already to begin measuring and will be reporting progress on their commitments in 2026 and 2029. And then there's ongoing work to actually move the resources and especially activate the GBF fund. My slides are moving a little slowly. And I was going to back to Deb.
Yeah, I'll jump in. So, I think a lot of you are saying, why does this matter? The investments that we're talking about are mainly for countries outside the US, a lot of developing countries. I think for me and thinking about being there, the Global Biodiversity Framework really is it's a call to action. I think it's a major, it was a demonstration of the global community coming together on a common goal, and that saying, if we don't act now, we're in trouble. I mean, there's that, we have that underlying, I think we all feel that, the time bomb, the ticking clock, and how we need to act. And it was encouraging me to see unity. And I think that is one of the things that as being in North America and particularly working in the US is to remember that our efforts are not alone. There are major efforts happening globally, and that we can learn a ton from what's happening there, but also share experiences from here. I mean, and that's one of the roles that CLLC is able to play. And one of the roles that NLC plays too, in terms of ensuring there's information exchange and mentoring happening across the US. One thing I do really want to point out is that when the Biden administration came into office, one of their first actions was to put in place America the Beautiful, and that initiative, which is truly a 30 by 30 goal. It's a landscape-driven effort. And so I think we need to continue to give kudos to the Biden administration around that, because we were one of the first countries to really step up with that 30 by 30 goal. I also want to highlight California's work. In terms of at the COP, California actually brought 50 representatives from conservation, state legislators, because they have made a pretty serious commitment to the 30 by 30 goals, and many of the elements of the Global Biodiversity Framework are influencing their work plan moving forward. And so again, I think we can learn a lot from what they've done. Erin and I, as we work with partners across the globe, are using both the America the Beautiful and the California example as a way that countries can develop their work plans. So just highlighting those as something we shouldn't forget about, and leadership that has been demonstrated here. I also think we can look north of the border, and as Erin highlights here, Parks Canada has a national program specifically on ecological corridors. I think the Indigenous Guardians program and the investment there is pretty phenomenal, and something that we could push for here and learn from. So those are, Erin, I don't know if you wanted to add to that at all.
Well, it is kind of my mantra that so many international processes have the opportunity to set mandates and to inspire cooperation at international levels, and we all are doing this work together, regardless of what country, and regardless if it's at national or subnational level. That we are all contributing towards achieving these goals, and a lot of that is sometimes just being able to see yourself or your organization in that broader picture.
And I'd also emphasize there's still, I mean, while the Global Biodiversity Framework was signed right at the, right before Christmas, a lot of those decisions haven't even been formally announced. Like, there's just still coming out. And I think this next year, there's a lot to be determined in terms of how this plays out. And so I think as a conservation community, keeping an eye on that and kind of seeing both investments that are being made and also lessons to be shared and learned from. So, Erin, I think we could go to questions.
Thank you both so much for providing that presentation and context. I've learned a lot already. We have a couple questions in the chat, but please don't be shy. Submit your questions either via chat or the Q&A. I think I just want to start by going off of something you just ended on, Deb, of, how do people stay engaged? And the last question that we came up on the chat is, how do initiatives, like, how can we as initiatives see ourselves in that bigger picture? And how does this really trickle down to that local level? What are those different opportunities and avenues that local level folks can engage in these larger global conversations?
That's a great question. And Erin, I'm going to have you actually, can you just stop sharing if you get just, that'd be great. Well, I think there's a couple avenues. I mean, the Convention on Migratory Species, the Convention on Biological Diversity and the United Nations Environment Facility all have some pretty excellent websites and newsletters. So I think that's one way, is to kind of follow that way, but that's still pretty high level. The Network for Landscape Conservation will be following this and trying to highlight, as well as the Center for Landscape Conservation. And so those are two opportunities. Erin, I think maybe highlighting, do you want to highlight the Connectivity Conservation Specialist Group as a way too that will be filtering information?
Oh yeah, so that's one thing I wanted to mention. As individuals and experts working out there, practitioners, we do offer the opportunity to join as a volunteer member of the Connectivity Conservation Specialist Group. So that allows you to to be part of, well, understanding and receiving more information, but also being able to contribute as we as a group work together. You can also, as your institution, if you do want to be more involved and directly involved in these discussions, you have the opportunity to apply to be an observer to the convention, just like we have as the center. And that does then give you a certain rights and also commitments yourself to do those things in alignment with international agreements.
Yeah, Naomi, I'm not sure that totally answered your question. I think it is hard. I think that again, I would just say the next 6 months to a year, I think are when we're going to be seeing a lot of moving from theoretical in some ways to implementation. And I think that's when we'll see a lot more case studies and sharing happen also.
Maybe I can also mention it's also being aware that these things have happened and that there's something where you see that your work is contributing towards it, and then really thinking about it in that context, that when you are doing your work, you're not just meeting the objectives of your organization or state or national commitments in one way, but that you truly are doing international conservation in every small effort that you take.
That's great. Thank you so much, Aaron and Deb. And kind of going off on that, we have one question here. Are there any specific notable success stories you heard in Montreal that can learn from? And also just expanding that to, are there any examples of country level efforts that you see underway that are really working towards meeting these standards? Because I think that brings it from that theoretical space to more of those metrics and reality of these partnerships trying to do this work.
Aaron, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, so I think one of the best things making lemonade out of lemons of the 4-year-long process that it took to actually agree on the framework is that there's already lots of really good projects and lots of really good thinking already underway. So by the time we had gotten to Montreal, Tanzania had actually finished its corridor identification, prioritization, and action plan, which is actually a comprehensive document that allows them to already hit the ground running in having a connectivity plan for their entire country. So those are the types of inspiring things that are already moving, and we don't have to wait for funding to flow or to even start the action. And there's a lot of good examples like that.
That's great. And actually, we just had a question as you're speaking come up a little bit more specifically on monitoring framework. Thinking about some case studies, and I think maybe Tanzania is a good example of where they're kind of using these indicators and are being applied. I think a lot of folks are wondering, are there strengths in certain indicators, some things that are just like really easy to put into their planning efforts, where there are some that are a little bit more challenging from the global down to the local. I think there's a lot of folks interested in learning more or recommending some resources to learn a little bit more about the monitoring framework as a whole.
Yeah, so I must admit the monitoring framework is kind of a mixed bag of very powerful spatial tools and sometimes just basic levels of measurement, like the protected areas headline indicator is all about the actual number and coverage of protected areas around the world. Whereas if you want to measure the connectivity of freshwater systems, there's a spatial tool that is out there and available. So that process of refining the monitoring framework is ongoing and it will get better. But countries are only going to report right now on what were called headline indicators. And that's something that we feel strongly that, yes, it's nice to have a headline indicator, but sometimes you have to measure numerous things at numerous levels using many different metrics to actually be able to do that. So for connectivity or for landscape conservation, I think we're moving towards a more refined, say, toolkit of specific indicators that are going to really empower people, especially working on these topics, to be able to measure it even better.
Yeah, Devin, anything to add on that, kind of thinking about those toolkits? I think there's some folks who are really interested in, are these ideas of toolkits being accumulated and kind of thought about and distributed to this community and NLC community, others? I know everything's evolving and changing, Aaron, as you said, but are folks capturing that and trying to push that forward so people are just aware and also maybe can take some preliminary metrics to their partnerships?
It's an excellent question. And I think that's, well, for us at the center and our partnerships with WWF and the Convention on Migratory Species, that's really the next step we're taking. We have an initiative called the Wildlife Connect Initiative that the 3 organizations are in. And we are now in our 3rd year, but we officially launched it at the COP. That idea of being a repository for knowledge, expertise, and sharing of tools is exactly what that initiative is about. So that's exactly where we're heading with a lot of our work right now. So Kat, that knowledge platform isn't necessarily up and running at the moment. It's more in pieces, but that's exactly the step that we're taking. And I think we're going to see that with a lot of the other initiatives too, beyond connectivity and landscape conservation. So in terms of information exchange, I mean, this is a really good reminder for us to help that going forward. And I think NLC can be a great venue to do that through. So as those resources become available, we can share them. I would also point out, again, I'll go back to California and the work that they're doing and their biodiversity working group and their 30 by 30 initiative. I think that they have monitoring groups. They actually have working groups that are being put together. And I think we can look to them too as a source of knowledge. And so there'll be a lot of cross-fertilization, I think, happening between us and the work there and NLC and then globally.
I think that's great. And we just there's a lot of questions, so we apologize if we can't get to them all, but I'm trying to weave a couple together so we can address some. But I think kind of on that note, Deb, of looking to California as how they're establishing structures to really pursue metrics and kind of get work on the ground to achieve 30 by 30. Are there lessons that we can take to share with other countries a little bit more regularly? I'm thinking, Deb, just because I professionally know you, thinking about traveling to Australia and sharing the insights there to make sure that these metrics are a little bit more consistent. And I think you can see in the chat, there's a little bit of a longer explanation of that one, but thinking on those lines, how do we approach that?
Yeah, great question. I'm thinking about a couple of things. So Gary and I in particular spent, and others, there were 10 of us who spent a month in Australia this fall, really working with conservation leaders there and decision makers there on prepping for 30 by 30 and thinking about landscape conservation. I think when I think about the needs that we saw there, and I think that we see across the globe, a lot of it comes down to this knowledge sharing, but also capacity building. So that's something I personally, we're working to figure out, can there be an international catalyst fund idea, or can we continue to foster mentoring and knowledge exchange throughout ways? So I don't know, Kat, if that kind of hits on what you were wondering about. But yeah, that we definitely are engaged trying with countries like that, trying to take some of the lessons learned here and apply them there, or support them there. Yeah, and I think capacity plus the knowledge sharing is a critical component. And I think doing those, going to the COP15, going to these meetings, and actually physically going to countries outside of our own is a space that CLLC has really been powerful with, and NLC with the knowledge building, capacity building opportunities. Any other things to add, Aaron, on that before I
pivot to another question.
I think there's so much great learning that can flow from the United States or from Canada, and is also flowing back now from so many of the partners that we work in other countries. So if we can continue that exchange, and a lot of things that we, well, especially in the past, have done as a center, is to bring people here, and for us to go out there in the world and just continue to share the experiences that we're having together.
Yeah, and Deb, I'm thinking about, you know, a large contingent of California folks coming in to even be present at COP15, and providing that feedback and knowledge exchange is really important. And I think there is a common understanding that there's a bit of challenges of how do we, even if we're not party to the agreement, how do we really engage and bring people together? And Aaron, I think you just highlighted, you know, sharing stories with each other, trying to listen to each other, even if we're not a part of the you know, the agreement, we can still learn from the agreement. So just maybe talk a little bit more about the moments that you've learned through this exchange, and what you guys are personally maybe taking from your experience. I'd love to kind of wrap up, and if there's other questions, continue with those. But
I'll jump in, and I think there's a massive amount. I mean, actually, I have some hope, which there are times when we don't feel very hopeful, right, as conservationists. And but I did feel a lot of hope at that event. I felt hope, you know, the youth engagement, the people from all over the globe who showed up and wanted to find solutions. I think one of the fact that there were such investment present, there was a presence from financial institutions and investors, and conversation around things like a biodiversity credit, you know, or now we're actually talking to other entities who are thinking about, well, how could we do a connectivity credit? Like, and granted, you worry about greenwashing and you worry about those, is that a really market-based solution? Is that a durable thing? But God, to even be having those conversations is encouraging. I'm just going to pivot really quick to what Gary also pointed out to James in the question around the definition of protected areas and how those are defined moving forward. I think that's also, there's still a lot to be figured out with this 30 by 30 goal. And I think Gary's point in regards to the High Ambition Coalition and the other efforts that are underway, it's not set in stone yet. And that's also somewhat, I guess, when you think about the next chapter here, we can actually have quite an influence on how this looks and what, how the Global Biodiversity Framework is carried out. Anyways, that's a little bit trying to tie back to James's question.
no, I think that's great. And I think specifically you're mentioning, I think the last point of the nature accounting and the challenges there and the things that need to be figured out. But I think, as you're saying, there's hope, there's an opportunity, because there is this transition and trying to figure out what is what and defining things. I think there's also an opportunity to partake in defining them together. And I think, for example, the High Ambitions Coalition and others, I think you sewed a lot of things together, Deb, so really appreciative of that. Aaron,
I just want to raise one more point really quickly, and I think that Aaron and I haven't touched on that as much, partially because it's not our expertise, and I do just want to call this out. I think while there was a great presence from Indigenous leaders and a request and even walking out of negotiations at times, the role of Indigenous protected areas, I think that's also an area that is still not fully settled, and there's a lot of work to be done there. And again, that's not our expertise. But I just point out that was not finalized at the negotiations, and we all know how important the role of Indigenous rights, Indigenous people is in the future of this Global Biodiversity Framework. And so I think that that's also an area where the next 6 months to a year, we're going to see a lot more conversation around.
I can just add, every country is going to do this differently. Every country may decide differently on like what they're going to count towards 30 by 30. But one of the best things we can do is to continue to show that there are these consistent practices and there are these tools that are readily available and that people can use in their own context and be successful in their own ways. So there's only so many frameworks that you can provide, and then you want to give ownership of that framework to be able to do the best work that countries can do.
Yeah, I think that's great. And we only have a few more minutes left. Deb or Aaron, any questions or things that you have picked up in the chat that I may have missed that you would like to address? I know things have been flying and great conversation on the chat, so really appreciate the contributions of the viewers. And I know we won't get to all questions, but I expect we'll have the recording. And if you have any additional questions, please feel free to email me directly. All of our information is on our website. But anything else, Deb or Aaron, that I may have missed or questions? I know we talked a little bit about the biodiversity credit, maybe just a brief mention of those conversations before we close off.
Yeah, I can touch based on that. There is definitely a move around the globe with a number of leaders, including here in the US, in climate credit leaders and companies who are looking at that question of biodiversity credit, cultural fire burn credit, connectivity credit. So it's all on the table. I think that Australia has probably historically been one of the leaders in that in terms of testing that idea out. But I think that's something for all of us to keep an eye on moving forward. Is there a market for that? Again, California may end up being one of the test cases for that. That's what I'm hearing. So just throwing that out. We'll know more, I think, soon. But there's the desire, obviously, to figure out ways to fund this. And Aaron and I didn't really get into this, but one of the major sticky points of the COP, and if you do any reading on this, was the fact that we didn't reach all of the goals. The money was not put on the table to necessarily reach the goals of the Global Biodiversity Framework. There's still a huge deficit that has to be raised. So and countries can make up some of that. Private philanthropy can make some of that, but also this idea of a market for biodiversity is also what people are looking at, because there's such a massive deficit to actually reach these goals. And I think this OECM concept, I'm just going to touch on that. There's so much there, and I don't think we have time to get into it, but that is exactly one of the sticky points when we were in the negotiations around the 20 by 30 goal, is what qualifies. And there's still, I mean, Aaron, I don't know if you could just hit on that really quickly and maybe where people would be able to find more
officially
info.
What can qualify are the 2 area-based conservation designations, which is protected areas, or OECM's conserved areas. Right now, that is truly what counts officially at CBD level, but countries are also going to decide how they best want to do that, and things will surely change over time. So that gets at some of, land easements or ecological corridors, as we have been talking about. How do all of those things add up, and how do they truly make a difference?
So we're just about at time, and we always run out of time. So I really appreciate, Deb and Aaron, your expertise and just sharing your experience at COP15. I think it was really valuable, and obviously a lot of conversations still to be had, and potential growing topic that maybe we can foster some more conversation around. So I will just thank you both and end this quickly with a couple updates from the Network for Landscape Conservation. So this webinar is part of the ongoing Landscape Conservation Action webinar series. A recording of this webinar will be posted, so you can go back to it on our website, and I will post the website in the chat. We do have an upcoming webinar on March 28th at 4 p.m. Eastern, focused on the biosphere regions, act globally, cooperate locally. So we're going to learn a little bit more about the U.S. Biosphere Network, which some but not all have heard of. And there's 28 across the United States. They're all internationally recognized by the World Network of Biosphere Reserves of UNESCO. So speakers will talk about the biosphere regions, and how to integrate socioeconomic and environmental concerns, and provide a case study of the Golden Gate Biosphere Network in the United States. So we really look forward to having you participate in the next one. Thank you again, Aaron and Deb, so much for your participation and
Kat.
all of the active chat. And please don't hesitate to reach out to us if you have other questions, and we look forward to seeing you on the next one. Thanks all.